The silk of her emerald gown shrieked against the floorboards as Lady Amelia Rosewood turned her back on the massive, four-poster altar of her 7-year isolation. A jagged bolt of lightning fractured the sky outside the window, momentarily turning the bedroom into a stark, monochromatic theater of war. In that flash, the hierarchy of Blackthorn Manor didn't just tilt, it shattered. "Amelia, please." The sound was guttural, a raw, wet noise that did not belong to the Iron Duke. Sebastian Blackthorn, a man whose pride was as legendary as the coldness of his blood, was no longer standing. He had collapsed onto the rug, his knees hitting the wood with a dull thud that echoed louder than the thunder. His hands, usually gloved and steady, were white-knuckled as they clamped onto the heavy silk of her hem. He wasn't just holding her, he was anchoring himself to the only thing left in his world that wasn't a lie. Amelia did not flinch. She stood as a pillar of vibrant green, her posture so rigid it seemed to repel the very air he breathed. She did not look down. To look at him was to acknowledge his existence, and for 2,555 days he had denied her that same courtesy. "Let go, Sebastian," she said. Her voice was a terrifying calm, a clinical melody that cut through his ragged breathing. "You are staining the fabric." The indignity of the scene was total. In the shadows of the doorway, 3 maids stood paralyzed, their faces pale masks of disbelief. This was the social ruin the gossips had prayed for, the Duke of Blackthorn, reduced to a supplicant in his own bedchamber, begging for the attention of a woman he had treated as a ghost. The servant's eyes darted from his contorted, tear-streaked face to Amelia's stoic, unyielding back. Tomorrow, every kitchen and drawing room in London would know that the Duke was a beggar, and the Duchess was a queen who had finally abdicated her misery. "I'll give you anything," he choked out, his forehead pressing against the emerald silk. "The estates, the name, my life, just don't walk out that door, just look at me once." Amelia finally moved, but only to reach down. With a strength born of 7 years of suppressed rage, she pried his fingers from her gown, one by one. She didn't do it with heat. She did it with the cold efficiency of a woman closing a book she had finished reading long ago. "You once told me my touch was a debt you refused to pay," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the heavy trunk waiting by the door. "Consider the debt settled." As she stepped out of his reach, the lightning struck again, illuminating the hollow space between them, a chasm 7 years wide that no amount of begging could ever hope to bridge. The memory surged forward, unbidden and cold, drowning the sounds of the present storm. 7 years ago, the air in this very room had been thick not with the scent of rain, but with the cloying sweetness of white lilies and expensive wax. Amelia had sat on the edge of the expansive bed, her fingers trembling as she unpinned the heavy lace of her bridal veil. She was 19, terrified, and traded like a prized mare to settle the Rosewood gambling debts. When the door had swung open, she expected a monster or a lover. Sebastian had been neither. He stood in the doorway, the candlelight carving his features into a mask of aristocratic disdain. He hadn't even removed his coat. He looked at her not as a bride, but as a stain upon his family crest, a living reminder of the men who had swindled his father into an early grave. "Do not bother making yourself comfortable in my presence, Amelia," he had said, his voice as sharp and thin as a razor's edge. She had looked up, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sebastian, the guests, the priest, we are wed." He had stepped into the room then, but only far enough to cast a long, suffocating shadow over her. "We are bound by law, not by desire. Your father's blood runs in your veins, and I will not have it mingling with mine. You wanted the Blackthorn name, you have it. You wanted the protection of this roof, it is yours." He walked to the bedside table, extinguishing the single lamp that sat between them. In the sudden dimness, his blue eyes had flashed with a calculated, shimmering cruelty. "I will provide your bed, Lady Amelia, but I will never warm it. You will live in this house, you will eat at my table, and you will carry my name to the grave, but you will remain as untouched as the day I bought you." The silence that followed had been a physical blow. She had waited for the punchline, for the softening of his expression, but there was only the sound of his retreating footsteps and the final, echoing click of the door being locked from the outside. That night, Amelia had curled into a ball on the far edge of the mattress, realizing that her happily ever after was a life sentence of invisibility. He had condemned her to a winter that lasted 7 years, never suspecting that beneath the ice he had created, something was hardening, not into a broken girl, but into a woman who would eventually learn that a cold bed was far better than a heartless one. While Sebastian sought the distraction of candlelit gaming dens and the practiced laughter of women who traded affection for gold, Amelia had retreated into the only sanctuary he couldn't touch, his mind. If she was to be a ghost in his house, she decided she would be the spirit that kept it from crumbling. The transition began in the 3rd year of their hollow union. She had found the estate ledgers gathering dust in the library, their pages weeping with the red ink of looming ruin. Sebastian, blinded by a decade-old vendetta and the hedonism of his own neglect, had failed to notice that his stewards were vultures and his investments were ash. With the same quiet precision she used to embroidery silk, Amelia began to unpick the knots of his failure. Night after night, while the carriage lanterns flickered in the courtyard as the Duke returned from another dalliance, Amelia sat by a low fire in the solar. She corresponded with bankers using a masculine pseudonym, restructured the tenant leases in the north, and liquidated failing shipping lines to buy into the burgeoning steel trade. She didn't do it for him, she did it for the Rosewood name she still carried, and for the hundreds of families whose livelihoods depended on the Blackthorn lands. She became the silent architect of his survival. When a lucrative contract was signed in the city, Sebastian assumed it was his own lingering reputation that secured it. When the winter wheat yielded a record profit despite the blight, he credited the weather. He never noticed the ink stains on her fingertips during the rare, silent dinners they shared. He never wondered why the solicitors began addressing correspondence to the office of the Duke, with a meticulousness that hadn't existed during his father's reign. Amelia watched him from the shadows of the gallery, a man who believed he was master of all he surveyed, never realizing he was standing on a foundation built entirely by the woman he refused to look at. She had mastered the art of being essential while remaining invisible. She had saved his fortune, preserved his legacy, and guarded his house, all while he was busy proving how little he valued her. As the years bled into one another, the irony became her only comfort. Sebastian Blackthorn was the wealthiest man in the peerage, and he didn't have the slightest inkling that every coin in his pocket was a gift from the wife he had vowed never to touch. She held the keys to his kingdom, and as she looked at the dissolution papers now resting on the mahogany desk, she realized it was finally time to show him just how much of his world was about to vanish with her. The evening had begun with the familiar, intoxicating scent of jasmine and the soft rustle of silk in a darkened townhouse far from the cold silence of Blackthorn Manor. For 6 months, Lady Clarissa had been Sebastian's refuge, a woman who spoke in honeyed whispers and seemed to adore the man, not the title. But as the clock struck midnight, the illusion didn't just fade, it bled. Sebastian had returned to Clarissa's drawing room after a brief moment away, only to find the hidden wall safe behind the portrait agape. There stood Clarissa, her face stripped of its practiced warmth, clutching a stack of confidential deeds and the Blackthorn seal. In her hand was a dagger, not for his heart, but for his legacy. "You were so easy, Sebastian," she spat, the sweetness in her voice replaced by a rasp of pure malice. The Iron Duke, so desperate for someone to tell him he was right to be cruel that he handed over the keys to his vault. She wasn't just a mistress, she was an operative for the very syndicate that had been systematically dismantling the Blackthorn holdings from the shadows. With a flick of her wrist, she revealed the final blow, a forged power of attorney, signed in his drunken moments of misplaced trust, that had diverted his remaining liquid assets into offshore accounts. In one stroke, the man who had spent 7 years punishing his wife for her family's debts had become the architect of his own bankruptcy. He was a duke with a hollow crown, his accounts drained, his reputation a target for the morning gazettes. He arrived back at the manor as the storm began to howl, his coat soaked and his mind a fractured mess of betrayal. He expected to find the house in darkness, a mirror of his own ruined soul. Instead, he found the lights burning in the solar. He stumbled into the room, gasping for air, ready to confess that the Blackthorn name was finally dead. He looked at Amelia, expecting her to shrink away or offer the same empty silence she had given him for years. But as he began to stammer out the news of his ruin, he realized she wasn't listening with shock. She was looking at him with a pity that burned worse than Clarissa's dagger. "I know, Sebastian," she said softly, gesturing to the meticulous ledgers spread before her. "I've been watching her bleed you dry for months. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the man I saved from ruin, trying so hard to find it again?" In that moment, the justice of his position hit him like a physical blow. He had lost his fortune to a woman he thought he loved, only to realize his entire existence had been preserved by the woman he had spent 7 years trying to break. He was a king with nothing left but the loyalty of a queen he had never bothered to earn. The following morning, the atmosphere within the manor shifted with the weight of a changing tide. For 7 years, Amelia had dressed in the funereal shades of the Blackthorn lineage, dull greys, somber navies, and the suffocating black of a widow who was not yet dead. She had worn the family crest, a silver hawk pinned over her heart, like a brand of ownership. It was a visual penance for a debt she had never owed. But as the sun struggled to pierce the grey London clouds, Amelia stood before her mirror and reached for the silver hawk. With a steady hand, she unpinned the heavy metal, hearing the small, sharp click of its release. She did not place it back in her velvet jewelry box. She left it discarded on the cold marble of the vanity, a piece of scrap metal stripped of its power. From the depths of her wardrobe, she pulled the gown she had commissioned in secret. It was a masterpiece of emerald silk, a color so vibrant it seemed to pulse with its own internal light. It was the color of regrowth, of spring rising through the frost, and of the Rosewood family's ancient, defiant pride. As she stepped into the dress, the fabric hissed against her skin, the corset cinching with a finality that felt less like a constraint and more like armor. This was her war paint. She discarded the modest lace fichu that usually covered her throat, allowing the elegant line of her neck and shoulders to breathe. She did not reach for the Blackthorn diamonds. Instead, she wore nothing but the confidence she had cultivated in the dark. When she looked in the glass, the ghost of Blackthorn was gone. In her place stood a woman of terrifying presence, a sovereign who had spent 7 years learning the geography of her own strength. The maids whispered as she descended the grand staircase, their eyes wide at the sight of her. The emerald silk trailed behind her like a forest fire, consuming the gloom of the hallways. She didn't walk with the hesitant grace of a wife seeking approval. She moved with the predatory elegance of a woman who had already won. Sebastian was in the breakfast room, his head in his hands, surrounded by the wreckage of his morning correspondence. When the door opened, he didn't look up, expecting the same silent, grey shadow that had haunted his periphery for nearly a decade. But the sheer saturation of the emerald green caught the corner of his eye, forcing him to lift his gaze. He froze, the breath left his lungs as he stared at the woman standing before him. She looked radiant, lethal, and utterly unreachable. For the first time in 7 years, he didn't see a Rosewood he could punish. He saw a woman he had never truly known, dressed for the funeral of his authority. "The carriage is being readied," Amelia said, her voice like cool water. "I am no longer wearing your colors, Sebastian. I think it is time you learned how to wear your own." The air in the master's suite was thick with the ozone of the approaching storm, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the lungs ache. Amelia moved through the room with a terrifying deliberation, her emerald skirts rustling like a warning through the silence. She reached the center of the room, stopping beside the massive, four-poster bed. This expanse of dark mahogany and cold silk had been the silent witness to her erasure, the altar where her youth and affection had been sacrificed to Sebastian's spite. Sebastian stood by the window, his silhouette fractured by the rhythmic pulse of the lightning. He looked aged, the sharp lines of his face softened by the exhaustion of his own ruin. He watched her, his eyes tracking the vibrant green of her gown with a desperate, starving intensity. For 7 years, he had treated this room as a border he would not cross. Now, the space between them felt less like a boundary and more like a gallows. Without a word, Amelia reached into the silk folds of her dress and withdrew a heavy vellum envelope. The wax seal was not the Blackthorn hawk, but her own personal mark, a blooming rose entwined with thorns. She did not hand them to him. To do so would be to acknowledge a connection that no longer existed. Instead, she leaned over and placed the papers directly onto the center of the pristine, untouched duvet. The sound of the parchment hitting the silk was no louder than a sigh, yet to Sebastian it echoed like a gavel. "What is this?" he asked, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his knowledge. "The dissolution," Amelia replied, her voice devoid of both malice and warmth. "I have spent 7 years occupying this space, Sebastian. I have been the ghost you required, the steward you ignored, and the wife you refused to touch. Tonight, I am reclaiming the vacancy." Sebastian stepped toward the bed, his hands trembling as he reached for the vellum. He didn't read the legal jargon, he didn't need to. He saw the signatures of the highest magistrates in the land, secured by the very fortune Amelia had built in the shadows. The stakes were no longer about money or estates. They were about the sudden, violent realization that he was about to be left truly alone in a house he had never bothered to make a home. "You can't," he whispered, his eyes darting from the papers to her stoic face. "Amelia, the scandal, the family name. The Blackthorn name is a hollow shell, and you are the one who broke it," she said, her gaze leveled at him with the weight of 1,000 lonely nights. "I am leaving tonight. You once told me you would never warm this bed. I am simply ensuring you never have the opportunity to change your mind." The lightning struck then, illuminating the papers on the bed like a white flag of surrender. The untouchable queen had finally made her move, leaving the Duke to realize that the bed wasn't just empty, it was a grave for the man he used to be. The realization didn't come as a wave, but as a sudden, violent drowning. As Sebastian stared at the papers on the bed, the architectural brilliance of the last 7 years finally aligned in his mind. Every crisis averted, every debt settled, and every coin that had kept the Blackthorn name from the gutter, it hadn't been his own wanting luck. It had been her. He looked at Amelia, really looked at her, and saw not the placeholder bride he had bought, but the savior he had systematically insulted. He had spent years chasing the heat of superficial fires, while the sun itself had been sitting in his library, keeping his world from freezing over. "Amelia, wait," he gasped, the words catching in a throat constricted by a sudden, terrifying panic. She reached for the handle of her valise, her movement fluid and final. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the final nail in the coffin of his pride. Sebastian reached out, his hand hovering in the air as if to catch a spirit, but she didn't even flinch. She was already gone in every way that mattered. The body in the emerald gown was merely a formality. The weight of his own monumental stupidity finally crushed him. The Iron Duke, the man who had stared down creditors and rivals without blinking, felt his legs turn to ash. With a strangled sob that tore through the quiet of the room, he collapsed. He didn't just sit. He fell to his knees, his body folding in a pathetic arc of gravity. His fingers, desperate and trembling, tangled into the heavy emerald silk of her skirt, anchoring him to the floor. "Please," he choked out, his face contorting into a mask of raw, unbridled agony. Tears, hot and shameful, tracked through the dust of his pride. "I didn't know. I was blind, I was a fool, I was a monster, but stay. I will give you the keys. I will give you the title. I will crawl across the coals of this entire city if you just don't leave me in this silence." He pressed his forehead against the hem of her gown, his shoulders shaking with the force of his breakdown. It was an ugly cry, a total dissolution of the Blackthorn persona. He was no longer a duke. He was a beggar at the gates of a temple he had spent 7 years trying to burn down. Amelia looked down at the crown of his head, her expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. For 7 years, she had dreamt of this moment, of seeing the man who broke her spirit brought to his knees. But now that he was there, clutching her hem and weeping like a child in the dark, she felt nothing but a profound, hollow exhaustion. The man begging for her touch was a stranger, and the woman he was begging to stay had died years ago in this very bed. "You're too late, Sebastian," she whispered, her voice a chilling breeze over his bowed head. "You finally want to touch me, but you've forgotten I've already turned to stone." The bedroom door stood ajar, a jagged mouth through which the inner sanctum of the Blackthorn lineage was finally exposed. In the flickering corridor, the witness wall had formed, a row of servants standing in frozen, breathless silence. There was Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper who had seen 30 years of ducal stoicism, Thomas, the footman, and the young chambermaids, their eyes wide and reflecting the lightning that continued to tear through the sky. They were not merely watching a domestic dispute, they were witnessing the death of an era. The image burned into their minds with the permanence of a brand. The great Iron Duke, the man whose shadow could silence a ballroom, was a heap of trembling cream wool on the floor. His fingers were white neck's gold, desperately clutching the emerald silk of the Duchess's gown as if it were a life raft in a rising tide. His cries, ragged and unrefined, echoed down the marble hallways, stripping away the last remnants of his formidable mystery. To the staff, he was no longer a master. He was a shell, a man hollowed out by the weight of his own belated regret. Amelia stood above him, her silhouette framed by the window's electric blue light. She was the only thing in the room that possessed gravity. The servants watched as she looked not at her husband, but toward the doorway, her gaze passing over them with a terrifying, calm clarity. In that look, the hierarchy of the house shifted irrevocably. They saw the silver hawk discarded on the vanity. They saw the emerald gown that signaled her rebirth. They realized with a collective shiver that the hand that had actually fed them, managed them, and kept the roof over their heads for 7 years was finally withdrawing its support. By dawn, the carriage had not yet departed, but the social ruin was already complete. The news traveled with the speed of a contagion. From the scullery to the stables, and eventually to the hungry ears of the London morning couriers, the story was the same. Sebastian Blackthorne had broken. The man who had vowed never to touch his wife had been found begging for her mercy on his knees, while the Duchess, the silent, invisible Rosewood girl, had stood over him like a conquering empress. The Blackthorne legend had survived wars, scandals, and debt, but it could not survive this singular moment of pathetic vulnerability. As the servants turned away to begin their duties, they did not look to the Duke's study for orders. They looked to the emerald figure in the hallway, realizing that while the Duke held the title, the Duchess held the soul of the estate, and she was taking it with her. The storm reached its crescendo as Amelia reached the threshold of the master suite. The heavy oak door stood open like a portal to a world she had forgotten existed, one where the air didn't taste of dust and disappointment. Each step away from the bed was a physical shedding of the last 7 years, the emerald silk of her train sweeping over the floorboards with the sound of a long-awaited exhale. "Amelia, stop." Sebastian's voice cracked, a jagged sound that tore through the booming thunder. He crawled toward her, his dignity a ruined thing trailing behind him like a tattered shroud. He reached the edge of the doorway, his hand slamming against the frame to steady himself. He looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and wild, reflecting a man who had stared into the abyss and realized it was his own reflection. "I will give it all to you," he choked out, the words tumbling over one another in a frantic, desperate rush. "The title, I will petition the crown to make you the sole executor. The lands, the accounts, every brick of Blackthorne Manor, it is all yours. I will live in the stables, I will be your shadow. I will give you my blood, Amelia, if that is the debt you require." He was offering her the very world she had secretly saved, a kingdom he finally realized he didn't deserve to rule. He was bargaining with the only currency he had left, his life. He looked at her with a terrifying hope, a belief that there was still a price high enough to purchase her presence. He offered her his heart, not realizing that he was trying to hand a gift to a woman who had already learned to live without one. Amelia paused, her hand resting on the cool brass of the outer handle. She didn't turn around, but she tilted her head, the light of the hallway sconces catching the sharp, beautiful line of her profile. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the rain against the manor's stone skin. Sebastian held his breath, his entire existence suspended on the edge of her next word. He had offered her everything a woman of the peerage was supposed to want: power, wealth, and the absolute submission of a duke. He waited for the triumph in her eyes, for the flicker of greed, or even the heat of a well-earned vendetta. "You offer me your life, Sebastian," she said, her voice a low, haunting velvet that seemed to vibrate in the very wood of the door. "But you have forgotten the most important lesson of the last 7 years." She finally turned her head just enough for him to see the chilling clarity in her gaze, a look that contained no hate, only the vast, empty space of a soul that had moved on. "You cannot offer a woman a world she has already conquered, and you certainly cannot offer a heart that she no longer has any use for." She stepped across the threshold, the hem of her emerald gown clearing the frame. Her hand tightened on the handle, and as the door began to swing shut, Sebastian let out a haunting, wordless cry. The heavy oak moved with a slow, agonizing finality, narrowing the gap between the man on his knees and the woman who was finally free. The click of the lock was a soft, sharp sound that echoed louder than the thunder, leaving one question hanging in the freezing air. Would she truly walk into the night, or was the threshold only the beginning of his true punishment? Carriage wheels ground against the gravel, a rhythmic, departing crunch that sounded to Sebastian like the steady ticking of a clock counting down to zero. He stood at the window of the master suite, his forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching the red glow of the lanterns fade into the weeping mist of the London night. The emerald silk was gone. The scent of jasmine and steel was gone. The only woman who had ever truly known him had vanished into the storm, taking the light of the house with her. Sebastian turned back to the room, and for the first time in his life, he felt the true weight of the Blackthorn legacy. The ceiling seemed to stretch upward into infinity, and the shadows in the corners grew teeth. He looked at the massive, four-poster bed, the center of his petty 7-year war, and realized it was no longer a throne of pride. It was an island. He walked to the bedside and sat where Amelia had sat on their wedding night. He reached out to touch the duvet, his fingers grazing the indentation where the dissolution papers had rested. The silk was freezing. He pulled his hand back, a shiver racking his frame that had nothing to do with the dampness of his clothes. This was the coldness he had gifted her, a clinical, sterile void that didn't just chill the skin, but numbed the soul. He had forced her to live in this winter for 2,000 nights, and now the ice had finally claimed the entire house. He was the Duke of Nothing. The silent architect had withdrawn her support, and Sebastian could almost hear the foundations of his life groaning under the sudden vacuum. Every ticking clock sounded like her footsteps walking away. Every gust of wind against the eaves sounded like the rustle of her emerald skirts. He was surrounded by a fortune he didn't know how to manage and a title that felt like a lead weight around his neck. He realized then that Amelia hadn't just left him. She had sentenced him to become the very thing he had made of her. He was now the ghost haunting the hallways of Blackthorn Manor. He would eat in the silent dining room, sleep in the frozen bed, and wait for a touch that would never come. He had spent 7 years refusing to look at her, only to spend the rest of his life seeing her in every shadow. The Iron Duke leaned back against the headboard and closed his eyes, finally touching the absolute soul-crushing isolation of his own design. The house was finally quiet. And for Sebastian Blackthorn, the silence was the loudest scream of all. Did the Duke's breaking point satisfy your thirst for justice, or did Amelia leave too soon? Subscribe now for more tales of high-stakes redemption, domestic noir, and the power of the untouchable queen.